Okay. Just as a final point about that last days concept, Hebrew or Hosea 33, chapter 3, verse 5 mentions trembling. They will come trembling to the Lord and His blessings in the last days. That doesn't mean the end of the world. Okay, that's not what that means. We know this because the equivalent term in Hebrew is also used in a verse in Genesis 49, chapter 1. This is Jacob giving his last address, his farewell address to his sons. So they're all gathered around him. And it says, chapter 49, verse 1, Jacob called for his sons and said, gather around so I can tell you what will happen to you in days to come. That days to come is the same Hebrew word that we see here in Hosea, translated as last days. And then after that, Jacob goes on and tells them about what's going to happen to them as in their days to come, literally their days to come. What's going to happen to them after he dies, after they die, and their sons and the tribes come out of them, and what their legacies are going to be like in the tribes that they leave behind, which is what the rest of the Old Testament's about. That has nothing to do with the end times. It has nothing to do with the end of the world. And that's the same terminology, that's the same word that's being used here in Hosea 3. Talk about last days or days to come. So it does not refer, whenever you see this last days term, we don't want to think of it as being the end of the world. Okay, that is not what that means. I mentioned that the house of Israel is going to return to seek the Lord their God, David their king. The house of Israel never sought David the king. Okay, they're going to do that in the days of the church when Jesus, the son of David, sets up his kingdom on earth in the form of the church, and then Jews and Samaritans, from the descendants of them from the south and the north, as well as everybody else, is going to enter this kingdom under the kingship of David. Now that's been happening since the day of Pentecost onward, since Acts 2 onward. We're not talking about something that still hasn't happened, that it's going to happen at the end of time or something like that. Okay, so that was the biographical part of Hosea. Those first 3 chapters. Oh boy, excuse me, I had to change my position there. I like to do that between videos, not while I'm recording myself, but I didn't this time. I didn't. Sometimes I don't. This armrest of this chair is falling off, and so I have to be very gentle when I move around, because any jostling that I do is potentially the last straw that will cause this armrest to fall. And when this armrest goes, this whole chair is going to go. Yeah, the whole thing's going to fall apart. So, okay, so now we're actually going to get on to the substance of Hosea's message. So the first 3 chapters have provided us with the background, have given us the framework for Hosea's ministry. He was called by God to marry a woman who proved to be unfaithful. She may have been unfaithful from the start. I don't know. Okay. He may have gone to one of the promiscuous, unfaithful women of Israel and married an unfaithful. I just don't know. I'm not really clear on that. He may have married a woman who was faithful at first. It seems like the first kid that she had was Hosea's kid, and then became faithful later. I'm not sure. At any rate, she was unfaithful. The last 2 children she had definitely were not Hosea's. She somehow got separated from him, whether he divorced her and sent her away, or whether she ran off on her own. I'm not clear. Text doesn't say. But she ran off, and even the kids were told to rebuke her. And she ran off and did her thing for at least a period of time. And then God told Hosea to go get her back, and he did. He bought her for half the value that a woman her age is supposed to have in the marketplace. And this was all meant to be a visible, physical demonstration, an example to the Israelites of God's relationship with them. Hosea, in this case, stood in the role of God. Gomer stood in the role of Israel. And the children stood in the role of the children of Israel, the individual Israelites who live in the land of Israel. And they were supposed to be learning lessons from these physical, visible examples. During this time, Hosea would, in addition to having this woman as his wife and having these children, which I guess he raised, even if they weren't his legitimately, I guess. There's no indication that he put them out of the house. I don't know. During this time, he would have been ministering to the people in the northern kingdom around him. So in addition to having these physical, visible examples of himself and his wife and the three children that she bore, he would have also been speaking this message to them. So now, from chapter 4, the rest of the book, we get the substance of Hosea's spoken ministry. Now again, this is written down probably after he's finished delivering it. Sort of like Amos, who went out to the northern kingdom and gave his message and then left and wrote it down sometime later. Hosea is probably writing down the substance of his ministry after he's concluded it, or very near the end of the conclusion of it. But this is what he would have been telling the people of Israel during the time that he was living with them and ministering to them, and all this would have been going on. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites. Now this is, I believe, all supposed to be one long lesson. That's why we're going to try to read this all in one day. Now, in the longer prophetic books, Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, those are made up of separate incidents, and they will usually say, the word of the Lord came to me and say this and said that, or on such and such a day. Ezekiel, for example, breaks down his book pretty well by chronological. Okay, this is when this happened. On the second day of the second month or whatever, this happened. And then the sixth day of the sixth month of the sixth year, this happened, or whatever. I'm just giving random examples. And then Jeremiah does that a lot too. Isaiah doesn't do that so much, but Isaiah does have a lot of passages that begin with the word of the Lord came to me. Hear the word of the Lord, which I personally often take to mean begin in a new section of thought. We don't really see that. We don't see that at all here in Hosea. We don't see that in Amos. These shorter prophetic books, I don't think, are written that way. I think they're kind of meant to be spoken out loud in one session, which is why we're going to try to do that. I'm not going to try to do that with Isaiah, or Jeremiah, or Ezekiel. I'm not going to try to do that with those. But with these shorter ones, which we've already covered in Amos and Jonah and Joel, and here in Hosea and then following, I'm going to try to do these in one session. I may not be able to do Zechariah this way, but most of these I'm going to try to do in one session. And they are short. They're kind of meant to be done that way. Remember, in general, the scriptures as a whole are meant to be read out loud. I think it's wise to experience these teachings in the way they were meant to be experienced, to whatever degree that we can. Everything that's written in the Bible, from the very beginning to the very end, the oldest passages to the most recent passages, was meant to be spoken out loud. From the very first thing that was ever written, which probably the works of Moses in the day when he was out Mount Sinai, those early days after they came out of Egypt, till the very end of the revelation of John, 1,600 years later or so, everything that was written in the Bible was meant to be primarily spoken out loud. Some guy would have it, he would be reading it out loud in a group setting to a crowd of people. That doesn't ever really change. Now, later on, in the New Testament times, literacy is more common. There is more of a capability. In the early days, nobody would be able to read. Okay? When Moses is speaking to the people, Moses was a prince of Egypt and would have been well educated in all kinds of fields. But very few, the rest of them were slaves. Okay? Very, very, very few of the rest of them would have been able to read at all. The priests were taught to read, I'm sure. The scribes, of course, that's what a scribe was someone who could read and write. That's what made them different and special. Now, by the time you get to the New Testament, literacy is more common. If you were a man born free, chances were pretty good that you could read at least one language. Even a lot of women were literate at that point in time, although not as many. But, again, not slaves. Okay, this is kind of your... Now, there were a lot of slaves, too. Okay, like a third of their population was slaves. So they wouldn't have been able to. But if you were a male, not a slave, chances were pretty good that you had some literacy level. And, writing materials were more common. expensive, but not as rare as they had been. However, you're still talking about a culture in which these letters the apostles write, for example, are meant to be sent to these churches so that someone in the congregation, usually the guy carrying the letter himself at the beginning, would have done this. He would have read it out loud to the congregation as they were gathered all together, and then they would have discussed it. That's how this message was meant to be taught. So to whatever degree it's possible for us to do that, I think it's wise to do that, to capture that original intent. Anyway, and they were meant to be spoken, especially these, they were, to a large degree, they were meant to be spoken in one sitting, like one long sermon. So for these prophetic books, the shorter ones, that's what I'm going to try to do. Of course, it would help if I didn't spend 10 minutes talking about that, now wouldn't it? Okay, so here we go. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. Okay, so now we're kind of moving away from talking about Hosea's family. We've set that up as the background. We've set Hosea's family up as the illustration for what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the book. So now we're going to be talking about Israel. We were done talking about Gomer as the unfaithful woman, and now we're going to be talking about Israel as the unfaithful covenant partner. We talked about this covenant partnership has consistently been portrayed as marriage. God married Israel effectively when they came into covenant with him. That's the whole basis of marriage. Actually, in all honesty, going back to the very beginning, that's the whole reason why God instituted the covenant of marriage between man and woman in the first place, was to serve as an example of the sort of relationship he wants to have with his people. That's why when we talk about marital unfaithfulness in the Bible, it's always the woman who's going to be at fault. Because, twofold, two reasons for that. First of all, in their culture, the woman was always at fault. Okay? The Old Testament and the New Testament, too, does not understand the concept of marital unfaithfulness when it comes to the husband. Like that, there is no such thing. A husband who is unfaithful is essentially just a polygamist. And that was no big deal to them. So in their minds, there's no such thing as an unfaithful husband. Like such a thing doesn't even exist. But also because in this illustration, God is the husband and the people are the wife. And so God is going to be faithful. If either member of the covenant parties, the covenant party is not unfaithful, it's going to be the people. It's going to be the wife. And so that's why those two, from a theological perspective, the reason why the emphasis on adultery and unfaithfulness is always on the wife is because in the covenant figure, the wife is the people, and those are the ones we're the ones who are going to be unfaithful to God, who's always going to be faithful. And also that just in their culture, there was no such thing as an unfaithful husband. Like, such a thing did not exist. So we're done talking about Gomer, and now we're going to be talking about Israel, the people in the land. The Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in this land. There's no faithfulness. Actually, he has lots of charges to bring. He has several charges he's going to bring. Hosea, okay, Amos, when we read Amos, here's one of the, just an example of a difference between the kinds of prophets. These prophets were people, okay? And like people, they had different personalities and different things that riled them up or different emphases. Amos spoke specifically against their sin. He goes up there, he starts giving a sermon about all the things the nations around them are doing wrong. And eventually he says, here's what you're doing wrong. Here's what God has against you. And then he goes on a long list of things. Those are specific things. But he specifically points out a number of concrete things they were doing that pertain to specific laws they were breaking and saying, this is what you're doing. And he was a fire and brimstone sort of preacher. He goes out there and he speaks against their sin. Hosea does that too. But he speaks with more of an emphasis on the attitude, the mindset, the heart, the love, and the lack of love. He's going to talk more about their priorities being misplaced and their attitudes being wrong. He will talk about their specific sins, but he focuses more on just where they are mentally, emotionally, attitude-wise. Like their hearts were not in it. Their hearts were not aligned with God. There is no faithfulness, no love, No acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, and murder. Stealing and adultery. That's all Ten Commandments stuff right there. That's basic stuff right there. That's what happens when you have no faithfulness or love or acknowledgement of God. You start breaking the commandments. You start breaking the 10 Commandments, the 10 words, the most basic of them all, and you're going to start breaking all the rest too. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land mourns, or the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea are dying. There's always been a connection between sin and the land. I mean, even way back at the very beginning in Genesis 3, when God cursed Adam, he cursed the ground. He actually cursed the ground. Genesis 3, verse 17. To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife, and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food, until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. From the very, very, very beginning, Adam was taken from the ground, the dust of the earth. There's always been a connection between sin and the land. In the days of the flood, the earth was corrupted because of man's violence. Chapter 6, we're talking about the beginning of the flood. Verse 11, the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. Then after the flood, he makes a covenant with Noah and says this. This is chapter 9. Let's see here. Starting in verse 4, back to verse 5. For your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. Because there had been violence before. They were killing each other. We talked about that way back when we read Genesis. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And from each man, too, I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God, he is God made man. When Cain kills Abel in Genesis chapter 4, Genesis 4, verse 10, the Lord says, what have you done? He's talking to Cain after the murder of Abel. Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. When they killed their sacrifices, their animal sacrifices, they took the blood and they sprinkled it around the altar and then poured some of it onto the ground. There's always been a connection between sin and the shedding of blood in the ground. When God led Israel into the land, they were supposed to displace the nations that were there because the land had been polluted by them. And God said, just as an example, in Leviticus 18, starting in verse 24, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways. He just got done giving them a list of things not to do. Because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled. So I punished it for its sin. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. All these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. There's always been a connection between sin and the land. Somehow or another, when we commit sin, when we commit sin, the land itself is affected by it. And there comes a point when the land can't handle it anymore, and vomits us out. I don't know how that works exactly, but there's always been a connection between sin and land. And why is this happening? Because of this. Here we're going to get into some of the reasons why this is happening here. But let no man bring a charge, let no man accuse another. For your people are like those who bring charges against a priest. You stumbled because no one has any grounds on which to accuse anybody else, because we're all guilty. Basically, is what he's saying here. We're all guilty. Okay? Nobody has the authority, the moral authority, to accuse anybody else of any sin, except for God, speaking through his prophet Hosea, because we're all guilty. Actually, no, let me go ahead and start the video.